This talk is for a workshop on failure in human social systems and human institutions. And I was asked to speak about biology to give some background. And so my topic is how animals are designed and how they fail. And my first theme is what I call the paradox of robustness. And this was explained well by Herbert Spencer in the 19th century when he said that the consequence of protecting people from their own mistakes is to fill the world with fools. The idea is that if a system has built-in protections at the system level that protect from failure of its components, then that weakens the pressure on the components, and the components tend to decay in performance. So increasing robustness at the system level leads to decay in the performance of the components of the system. I'll give you an example from biology. In our bodies, we have 2 copies of each gene. You get 1 copy from your mother and 1 copy from your father. So you have this built-in redundancy. And what that means is that if one of the gene copies fails because it has a deleterious mutation, usually you're okay because the other gene copy can compensate. You still have 1 good working gene, and so you're fine. So you have redundancy built in. And the consequence of this redundancy is that individual gene mutations then often have little effect. And so the population then accumulates a lot of these gene mutations into the population. And so what we tend to think is that in the history of life, initially, organisms had only a single gene copy. And when that single gene copy failed for each particular gene, a single gene copy, and when one of those gene copies failed, then the organism failed. And so that weeded out the mutation from the population. And so mutations did not accumulate. Failure of a gene copy led to failure of an individual, and that mutated gene copy was lost. But at some point, there was a duplication in the number of genes, kind of redundancy. And once that redundancy happened, that increase in complexity, that protected individuals from mutations that caused the loss of a single gene copy. Then there was an accumulation of mutant gene copies into the population because of that redundancy and protection. Again, single mutations had little consequence, and so those mutations tend to accumulate. And so, for example, in your body, you probably carry between 50 and 100 gene mutations that are deleterious, but you're okay because the other gene copy for each of those genes is working and fine. But what that means is that we cannot go back to having a single gene copy. In your case, you would die almost surely if you only had 1 gene copy, because you have so many of your individual gene copies are non-functional. So what we see in general is that the redundancy and protection at the system level leads to an accumulation of decayed components, individual decayed genes. And this is irreversible because now we can't go back to the ancestral state where there's only a single gene copy. And so the general logic is increase in robustness at the system level leads to decay in component performance. And this is an irreversible process now because if you took away the increased robustness at the system level, the systems would fail. And so over time, we get a layering of increasing robustness and complexity at the system level, decay of components, and that's a form of irreversible complexity. And so in the context of today's discussion on human systems, the question is whether human systems share this evolutionary process of robustness and decay, leading to a form of irreversible complexity. My second topic is the hourglass architecture of design in complex systems. And this was an idea that was developed by John Doyle at Caltech. Doyle's an engineer, and he was interested in the architecture of robust complex systems in both engineering and in biology. And what Doyle said is that complex systems, robust systems, often have a layered architecture. There are multiple layers, and those layers tend to diversify within the individual layers. And the layers are connected and communicate by protocols. And so what we see is that you have a diversified layer at the bottom of the system. Then there's a narrow protocol that connects that diversified layer to a top layer that is also diversified. So we have an hourglass architecture, wide upper layer, narrow protocol that connects the layers, and wide lower layer. For example, in computers, there's a hardware layer. You can think of that as the basal layer. And hardware architectures for computers are fairly diverse. There's a number of different ways of building a computer that functions well. So we have a diversified hardware layer. And then we have a diversified software layer, because software can do many different things. And software is decoupled from hardware because the broad software layer talks to the hardware layer through an operating system. And the operating system is a narrow neck of the hourglass that's conserved. So you can have different kinds of hardware and different kinds of software, and you can mix and match the software and the hardware as long as there's an operating system that allows communication between the layers. And Doyle's argument is that the narrow neck that forms the protocol that communicates between layers is a site of failure and fragility, a site of attack. So computer viruses tend to attack the operating system because that's a conserved, repeatable form and architecture. In biology, we have a similar issue. We have throughout the history of life, DNA makes RNA makes protein. DNA is an informational layer. DNA doesn't actually do anything. It just stores information and tells the organism how to make itself. And then we have a protein layer, and protein layer is what does things. And throughout all organisms, those different layers, the DNA informational layer and the protein action layer, are connected by a narrow protocol. DNA makes RNA makes protein. And that protocol is the site of attack. In fact, this is where viruses, biology viruses, tend to attack at this central protocol. So this is consistent with Doyle's idea. I'll give you one more example from biology. In development, you are born and start life with a single cell when your father's sperm and your mother's egg unite to make one cell. And from that one cell, your body develops to contain about 40 trillion cells, with many different kinds of cells and tissues. And this is a developmental process, from one cell to 40 trillion cells. And throughout the history of life, what we see is that the earliest stages of development, from that single cell and then the first few cells that form the embryo, that these stages tend to diversify fairly rapidly between organisms, closely related organisms. And the adult layer that makes the different adult forms that we see, that diversifies fairly rapidly between species. But there tends to be an intermediate layer that's highly conserved and does not change very much. Now, we do not fully understand this, but it seems like that those intermediate layers could be thought of as like conserved protocols to connect the various things that happen early in development, where you get your first cells forming, and the final adult form. And so there's potentially then a fragile site in the intermediate stages of development that's highly conserved. Now again, that's still not fully understood, but that would be consistent with what we understand about architectural design and what we understand about development. And so the question again is whether human social systems and human institutions have that kind of hourglass architecture, and perhaps there are fragile sites that lead to failure with regard to communicating between different layers of organization in human systems. My last topic I'll mention briefly is that in biology we often see that characteristics of systems or organisms are achieved by a balance between strongly opposing forces. And this is fragile because when you have strongly opposing forces, then slight perturbations on one side or the other push the system very far in one direction or the other. We see this when there are trade-offs. For example, speed versus accuracy lead to two very powerful opposing forces. For example, when you're attacked by a parasite, it's important for your immune system to respond very quickly. There's a need for speed. And that very fast response tends to be inaccurate. Sometimes your immune system gets triggered when in fact there was no infection or no attack. And so you have to have a second layer that's involved in accuracy, that turns off inappropriate immune responses. So the immune response is the balance of strong triggers and strong negative regulators. And it looks like those opposing forces sometimes are imbalanced and lead to disease. Sometimes there's conflict of interest over traits, and that leads to two different forces opposing each other on the expression of a characteristic of an organism. And when you have these strongly opposing forces, then slight perturbations lead to very strong imbalances and often lead to disease and failure. And there are some known examples in biology where this happens and illustrates the process. So then again, we can ask whether strongly opposing forces arise within human institutions and human social systems, and whether those are sites of fragility and failure. So I talked about the paradox of robustness, the hourglass architecture of design, and strongly opposing forces, and asked whether those are factors which might also be common in human systems. Thank you.